The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now when Jesus heard of the death of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away, so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. You've probably found in your life that the things that you do that make an impact on other people are often really surprising. Sometimes they're not the things you expected. When I was on internship, which is in our system the 3rd year of seminary, it's the year when you're sort of a student pastor and you're working with a pastor in another congregation, I was there for about 7 or 8 months into the 1-year program, and my intern supervisor went on vacation. One of the traditions that happens when you're an intern and your supervisor goes on vacation is that instantly someone will die and you have to do the funeral. So this happened, and it wasn't unexpected. This was an older guy who had been in the hospital, and I had been visiting with him, and he died like the day that my intern supervisor went on vacation. So I met with the family, and I did the funeral, and we took care of everything, and I didn't think too much more about it until about 2 weeks later when my supervisor came back. And he said to me, "You know, whenever I go on vacation and I come back, I always check with all the people that the intern has worked with, including," so I went and I sat with the family and all the people that helped put together the funeral, and I really try to coax out of them what they really thought about how you did everything. Because, you know, you can learn from those experiences. And so he says, "So I want to tell you about this funeral that you did." And I said, "Okay, what about the funeral?" And he says, "Well," he says, "first of all," he says, "everybody thought that you were very compassionate with the family and you did a nice job of taking care of them. And they liked the way you did the service, and your sermon was great and everything was great." He says, "But to show you what really has an impact on people, I asked them what was the most important thing that they remembered about the way you did that funeral. And what they told me was that you moved tables." And I said, "Moved tables?" They said, "Yeah." He says, "Because, you know, you went down in the fellowship hall after the service, after the graveside for the reception." And I said, "Yeah, there were a few more people that showed up, so, you know, we were setting up tables." And he says, "Yeah, you helped move the tables." He says, "They talked about that nonstop. They thought that was the thing that had the biggest impact." He says, "Remember, some of the things that you do that are going to have the biggest impact are not the things that you expect." And that's true. And I think about that whenever I read this story about the feeding of the 5,000. Because you may realize that one of the reasons that we have 4 Gospels in the New Testament is that all of the Gospels tell the story of Jesus in a slightly different way. And they remember different events and different things that Jesus did. All of them report miracles that Jesus performed. And sometimes one or more of the Gospel writers will remember the same miracle. But there is only one miracle that Jesus did that is recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. You know what that miracle is? It's this one. It's the feeding of the 5,000. And as I reflect on that, I'm thinking, you know, if I were one of Jesus' first disciples, following Jesus around, seeing all of the miracles that I've read about in all 4 Gospels, and somebody said to me, 100 years from now, when they start to write down all this stuff, the thing that they're going to remember, the thing that's going to have the biggest impact, the miracle that everybody is going to write down and talk about, is going to be loaves and fishes. 5,000 people having supper in a lonely place. See, to me, that wouldn't be the thing I would expect would have the biggest impact. To me, I'd figure a miracle where Jesus raised somebody from the dead, that would have a huge impact. But when you look around and you read all the stories in the Gospels, you find out that Jesus raised people from the dead in all 4 of the Gospels, but it's not the same story. There was no one time that Jesus raised somebody from the dead and it had the same impact as 5 loaves and 2 fish. Or maybe I would think that the biggest impact would happen when Jesus cured some incurable disease, because there are a lot of things that today we can easily cure and treat that you couldn't do anything about. That should have had a huge impact. And in fact, Jesus cures people all the time in all kinds of different places, but it's not the same story that we read about in all 4 Gospels. So then I think, well, you know what? Maybe it's true. Maybe it's true that the way to your heart is through your stomach. So food really is important. But then, I would think that something more gastronomically interesting, like taking hundreds of gallons of water and turning it into wine. Now that's interesting. That's something that I would think would have a big impact. But that only happens in one gospel. The loaves and the fishes. The 5,000 people sitting on the hills. I mean, these are people who Matthew says are not even hungry because they don't have the money to buy food. They wanted to send them into the villages and let them buy it for themselves. These 5,000 people eating 5 loaves and 2 fish, that's somehow what ended up being the thing that people talked about, where they really experienced God's presence, God's love, God's impact on their everyday, real lives. Why was that? Why was it that the 5 loaves, the 2 fish, that feeding of the 5,000, why was it that made a bigger impact than all the other things that I'd expect to make an impact? You know, like the tables, it's not always clear why that makes a big impact, but maybe the fact that this story is remembered and made a big impact. Maybe this story is Jesus' call in our lives. Maybe this story is a reminder to us that when we live and share our faith with others, we're going to end up having an impact on people in ways that we can't imagine when we also are willing to do things that at the time just seem like simple, ordinary, not really super spiritual or religious things. I mean, the disciples were called by Jesus together and he says, go hand out bread and fish. Well, hand out bread and fish, anybody can do that. And it doesn't seem like a big deal. It's not like laying your hands on somebody and go, be healed! You know, you'd think that was the big spiritual thing, but he says, just share your food. That had the impact. Maybe that's the way Jesus is calling us to think about how we live our faith also. Maybe it is as simple, maybe, as sharing school supplies with kids that don't have them. With spending an afternoon with Habitat, helping build a house for somebody who doesn't have one. Maybe it's as simple as going to work camp for a week and helping repair somebody's porch. Maybe those are the things through which Jesus can work through us to have a big impact, because it makes God's love a real, tangible reality in people's actual, everyday lives. I wonder maybe if this story, for all the other things that it can mean, maybe this is also Jesus' call to us to remember that sometimes the impact that living our faith has on people ends up happening at those times when we are not trying to be impressive. Because sometimes we get in trouble because we want to, I love the numbers. I like to find out that, our numbers are better than some other churches, that somehow or other we've engaged more people in faith and things like that. When you start to worry about how you look, or what the stats are, or whether you're looking good to the outside world, that sometimes is the thing that gets in the way. This book that we're going to look at on August 20th called Unchristian, One of the things that this guy talks about in the book is he says a lot of times people get very negative impressions about Christians and churches because it sounds like everybody's really worried about how moral we look, or how impressive we look to the outside world, or whether we got enough money, or things like that. Sometimes the things that make the impact are the things that seem like they're going to get us big press. I mean, the disciples are asked by Jesus to take 5 loaves and 2 fish and then walk out and start sharing them with 5,000 people. That is an invitation to incite a riot. People are going, how come they got that bread and I didn't get that bread? And that's what they think they're doing. They think they're walking into something that is going to make them look like idiots. And yet that was the time, that was the moment that had the biggest impact. When people were willing to follow Jesus and do things that they thought were going to be, at best, completely forgotten. Sometimes it's when we get over ourselves that God can do the best work with us. And I wonder if maybe this story is Jesus' call to us to remember that if we live our faith and our life in such a way that we want it to have an impact on others, we have to be folks who are willing to actually address the needs and the questions of people outside of our community that they actually have. Not the needs and the questions that we want them to have. And sometimes we're really bad at that. Sometimes we got this attitude that, you know what you should need? You should need to come to church every Sunday and have your kids in Sunday school. That's what your need is supposed to be. Or maybe your need is that you need to feel absolved of the guilt and the heavy burden of all the horrible, terrible, no good things that you've done that you carry around with you all the time. Because then we got Jesus, and Jesus will forgive you, and that's great. But what if the people that we come into contact with aren't particularly feeling burdened by guilt and horrible things they've done? What if those folks are more feeling like those folks on the hillside that day with Jesus, who just sort of felt like they're in a lonely place in their life. They're kind of in a deserted place. They're not sure what's going on. They're not sure where God is. They're pretty sure if there is a God, God's not there with them. Are we willing to engage people in those kinds of needs, and with those kinds of questions? The questions people actually have. See, that's what Jesus did with his disciples in the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples came to Jesus and said, hey, you know, they're hungry. They need food. So send them away to the villages, Levy. Jesus didn't say, you know, you go tell them they were supposed to come out here to listen to a sermon and to listen to teaching. And they should be looking for spiritual food, not food to fill their bellies. He didn't do that. He said, okay, if they're hungry, if this is their need, engage them in that. Give them something to eat. Feed them. Help them. Because it's when we take what we have and engage people with their actual needs and their actual questions that God can work through us to have an important impact on the life of the world. You know, I still, to this day, don't understand why the tables had a big impact on my internship congregation. I'm still not even sure why the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes had a big impact on people 2,000 years ago. But I am sure that Jesus intended to have a big impact on people's lives, to make God's love a real and tangible reality in people's regular, everyday, normal existence. I'm sure that that is what Jesus is still about doing today. And that's what Jesus is calling us to do as well. Jesus is calling us to be folks who join him and open ourselves up to being folks who live and serve in ways that may not seem fancy, that may not seem particularly spiritual or religious, but in fact are the ways through which God can act in our lives, with us, and through us to make God's love a real and tangible reality in the lives of others.